On picturesque farmland in Pennsylvania's Franklin County sits a reproduction of a small stockade. This is Fort Loudoun, one of three fortifications built in British America during the 1750s named in honor of John Campbell, 4th Earl of Loudoun. This particular Loudoun was built in late 1756 as a result of Franco-American Indian war parties that were wreaking havoc on the frontier. This was part of France's strategy in the French and Indian War, capitalizing on their native allegiances to strike fear and demoralize the British Empire while freeing their own troops to use elsewhere in North America. Prior to this war, Pennsylvania had no standing army to protect itself. After much debate in Philadelphia, the Commonwealth approved the recruiting of provincial soldiers and installed new militia laws. Soldiers went to work erecting a chain of forts to deter the raiding parties, this one erected under the eyes of Colonel John Armstrong. While a sufficient stockade for a small local garrison, it was structurally inadequate for a large army. But in June of 1758, thousands of British soldiers came to encamp here and house their stores within the stockade. This was the beginnings of the Forbes expedition against Fort Duquesne, which John Armstrong was among the ranks of. This site was of particular importance to General Forbes and his second-in-command Henry Bouquet, as a council was held here with about 300 Cherokee and Catawba warriors. These would-be native allies had traveled from the Carolinas to support their British friends, but grew restless and disapproved of the slow, seemingly disorganized progress the army was making. The council proved unsuccessful. It's estimated only 50 warriors remained with the army. This would mark a fissure with British and Cherokee relations that would develop into its own conflict in 1761. Even with this setback, Forbes' army was able to advance across Pennsylvania and capture Fort Duquesne in fall of 1758. A small British military presence remained at Fort Loudoun, as the fort became a waypoint along the new military road that tethered Philadelphia and Pittsburgh together. This road became especially important when hostilities broke out between British and a confederacy of native tribes that became known as Pontiac's Rebellion. Henry Bouquet quickly moved a small army of several hundred through the gates of Loudoun and eventually on to the pivotal Battle of Bushy Run. At the end of the conflict, King George III proclaimed that all lands west of the mountains was to be deemed an Indian reservation. It's also required that any man wishing to trade with the natives to acquire the necessary license, outlawing firearms, ammunition, and alcohol to pass from Europeans to natives. But settlers around Fort Loudoun began to hear rumors that these items were still getting into the hands of the Indians further west. In March of 1765, a wagon train bound for Pittsburgh was captured by a local militia led by James Smith. They found wagons loaded with firearms ordered by trader George Croghan, who was smuggling these and other illegal trade items to Fort Pitt to sell to natives in a bid to recuperate losses from the previous conflicts. Smith, a former captive of the natives and now harboring heated opposition toward them, ordered the supplies burned on the road. The wagon master sought refuge at Fort Loudoun, then commanded by Lieutenant Charles Grant and a few dozen men of the 42nd Highlanders Regiment. What followed was nearly several months of hostilities between Grant's Highlanders and Smith's militia, dubbed the Black Boys because they darkened their skin akin to native war paint and used guerrilla tactics against future convoys. Multiple shootouts and prisoner exchanges between the two parties occurred. Local law enforcement insisted Grant needed magistrates' pass for convoys to pass safely and legally. In one altercation, Grant managed to capture several black boys, letting them free but keeping possession of their firearms. A later incident led to the lieutenant being apprehended by the rebels, threatened to be dragged to the Carolinas if he did not let go of their firearms. Grant managed to free himself and return to the fort. 9 months of harassing and skirmishing culminated on the evening of November 16, 1765, when the full force of Smith's militia surrounded Fort Loudoun and opened fire. Low on manpower and supplies, Grant called down his Highlanders from the bastions and hunkered in the center of the stockade. After 2 days of attack, Grant sued for peace. The weapons of the Black Boys were returned and the British abandoned the fort. This chapter has since been overshadowed by later acts of rebellion in New England and the full force of the American Revolution that followed. The land the fort once sat upon is relatively unchanged, although a 200-year-old farmhouse now overlooks the site. Several private and state-funded digs were conducted throughout the 20th century, but it wasn't until the formation of the Fort Loudoun Historical Society that the location was definitively spotted in the early 1980s. The reconstructed fort was dedicated in 1993. In the late 2010s, the stockade went through a second reconstruction, with work presently being conducted to rebuild the buildings that once stood within the walls. At present, the reconstructed fort hosts special events throughout the year, including an 18th century market and a reenactment of the Black Boys Rebellion. Anyone can explore the grounds throughout the day. Fort Loudoun is located just a few hundred feet south of Route 30, just east of the village with the same name.